I think it's one of those interesting things. If you sort of go and talk at conferences, there's often talks about leaders, and people seem very keen to engage people to speak who've been sort of great champions or hugely successful characters. I suppose the idea here is that if you look at enough apparently successful leaders, I say apparently successful, clearly someone like Alex Ferguson is successful, at least in footballing terms, maybe less so as a human being, but that is not the point, right? So if you look at enough of these examples of successful leaders, somehow it would be obvious what quality it is that you should draw from them, that you can learn from. And this is the sort of great man theory of leadership, right? So it's a bit like Thomas Carlyle had this theory that sort of it was very fashionable in the 18th century, the great man theory of history. And this is the idea that history is formed by these heroic characters who have great intelligence and charisma and force and so on, and they're the people who shape the world. And that is transparently not a great theory. And Herbert Spencer was very quick at that time to point it out and say, well, obviously, surely great men are shaped by their circumstances. And I think this is the real challenge of looking at leaderships. Are leaders, is it what leaders put into things, or is it merely the circumstances they find themselves in? So the reason I think we find the question of what makes a great leader or where great leadership arises from difficult is because we are prone to favour simplistic interpretations. And the one advantage you can give to the sort of great man theory of history or the great man theory of leadership, and it does tend to be men, I use the word advisedly in these terms, not because it's right, I'm just saying that's what's another thing that's wrong with it, but it's incredibly simple, right? You just a series of like these figures, and that's it, and they're responsible for everything. But of course, just because something's simple, it doesn't make it right or true or useful. I think the truth of leadership is very complicated, and it's that complexity which means that we are tempted to wrong solutions. So what I'm going to talk about for the next sort of 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes or so, is why we find diagnosing great leadership difficult. And I think probably if we look at, I suppose it's a great man bit of theory, but I think leadership should be a bit more like Adam Smith's invisible hand. No, of course, the invisible hand is very hard to illustrate using PowerPoint, so obviously you see the invisible hand is actually in the bottom right here. Right, so yes, that's very clever. Too clever maybe, but there you are. But in Smith's account of the invisible hand arranges markets. It's a force which all these things come together, and it's often observed by economists that says something like bread gets made. There's bread on everyone's table every day if they want it. And yet there is no one in charge of bread making. The market provides. Forces sort of move around so that so that farmers grow it, and the corn is turned into flour, and the flour is baked, and the bread is distributed, and no one needs to be in charge of any of this. And indeed, it's one of the obvious downfalls of a command economy that if you do appoint a minister of bread, often the consequence seems to be less bread. Because the complexity of the system is such that one person or one office really can't organise it. There is something about the sort of randomness, but the complexity of a market which can deliver things like that. Doesn't mean there aren't market failures and other things, which is why there's an old Soviet joke. You always tell a joke is not going to be very good because someone says there's an old joke flagging the potential of it being funny, but that someone sets up a communist utopia in the Sahara and it's all going well, and then 2 years later someone says, comrade, we have a problem, there's a shortage of sand. Right? And so there's this thing where that it seems that somehow if that seems to be true and we can accept that, why do we also hope that there can be great leaders who from the very top down can make things happen? We seem to hold these two things contradictory views in our head at the same time. So we need to think why that is and how we should maybe get past it. So I'm coming from this, as Leo says, from the point of behavioural sciences. I should just give you a little sort of like the strange life of me that got me here. So I was once upon a time an academic philosopher, and concluding that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a library, I went and got a job in an advertising agency, because that is the obvious thing to do if you have a PhD in philosophy, right? Well, it seemed obvious to me. So I worked in industry, as people like to say, for about 15 years. I still work in that industry on occasions. And so I've seen that kind of, I think it's a good example of kind of a modern knowledge economy worker. And in the last 6, 7 years, Behavioural economics suddenly became very fashionable with books like Richard Thaler's Nudge and Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I'm sure you look like the kind of audience who are aware of those books. Some of you may even have read them. And suddenly people wanted to apply this stuff to commercial contexts, to problem solving, and that's really what I've been working at. First the advertising industry, and then with lots of other people. And it's, curiously, although I didn't want to become someone who's tried to change organisations, I realised that you couldn't be a behaviour change expert and run training sessions which didn't change behaviour. This was clearly a paradox that I couldn't live with. So I had to learn how do I when I go into an organisation and I deliver some thoughts, some insights, how do I make sure they actually act on it? So more and more I've actually had to become, against my better judgment, a kind of leadership team building figure, because that's something I never necessarily particularly chose or wanted to be. Indeed, I'm not, well, you can tell me if you feel this rings true, but I've never described myself as a team player. I'd like working in teams, but it's only because I find if someone says to you, I'm a team player, that is the one person to not trust, right? That's the person who's like, it's not they're going to stab you in the back, they'll just come straight out and stab you in the front, right? So I've always felt you should never self-identify as a team player. It's an inherently suspicious thing to do, right? So it's part of that. But so I've had to think more and more about this one. So for those who don't know, the behavioural sciences looks at so-called cognitive biases, which are they're basically the difference between what you think people maybe ought to do, given their own premises and a sort of rational, dispassionate analysis of the situation, and what they actually do. And there's a whole sort of host of these, and I've thought about the ones that most appear to apply to leadership. And the most obvious to start with is, I think it's called, it's the credit pie conundrum, right? So if you have a group of people carry out a task and someone observes them on the outside and they give a score for credit to each person, and it's a percentage, their percentage will indeed add to 100 unless they're innumerate or don't understand the task, right? Because they can see what everyone did and they sort of mark it out. If you then ask the participants in it to give a score to themselves for the percentage of credit, you can pretty much guarantee it'll add up to plenty more than 100, okay? So because everyone tends to be more aware of their own input into a problem solving. And this seems obvious enough, right? But it's this very simple cognitive bias called mental availability. And it's just basically saying that your own efforts you think of immediately, whereas other people's efforts you have to make a bit more effort to understand. And I think it's part of the sort of modern way of working is we often work with people whose jobs are entirely opaque to us in what they actually do day to day. Even if we work with them for years in the same team, we really don't know what they do. So it's a lot harder to give credit you don't know or understand. So we credit ourselves too much. Now, the real kicker to this is that this is not a correctable sort of bias, or indeed is corrected for a small group of people. So there are some people who do indeed give the same score to themselves as the observer would give them to themselves. And those people, you might think, well, you hope, well, are they fantastically self-aware and self-effacing and they just see themselves very clearly? Well, maybe that's true, but they're also clinically depressed. And it turns out that if you do this exercise only with clinically depressed people, it goes a bit slower, but they do mark themselves very accurately. Now, the curious thing here is that marking being able to see yourself as others sees you appears to be in and of itself depressing. And this is what's known as, people dub the optimism bias. So it appears, if we want to survive the world, we have to be inherently optimistic. We have to think that we can do better than we might do. We have to think that things will turn out better than they might turn out. So this is rather like if you have a colleague and you've got to go to a meeting and someone says to this colleague, will they be on time? Right? And you can say, no, they're never on time. But you know full well if you said to that colleague, will you be on time tomorrow? They say, yes, I'll be on time, right? Because for yourself, you always believe you can reform your own behaviour and be better. Other people see it really clearly. It's like, Tom is always late, right? It's defining part of his character. So we tend to see ourselves slightly more generously. And if we didn't, we become depressed. And when we're depressed, we tend to see ourselves in that pessimistic way. And why do we need this optimism bias? Well, we need it because to succeed in life, we need to deal with risk and luck. So there's a couple of things here. So one, if we looked at many things which are risky, which is what we need to do to succeed both in team and leading situations, is to put ourselves in situation risk. Many risks we'd never take on if we looked at them probabilistically with a clear head. So Daniel Kahneman in his book gives a really good anecdotal example of meeting a couple who just bought a motel on a really beautiful stretch of interstate, and they say, "Oh wow, they're the only guests." And they say, "Oh, is it normally busy?" And they say, "Well, no, it's not normally busier, but we bought the place for a song from the last people when it went out of business." And they say, "Well, how many people have tried to run a motel here?" 7, right? It says, yeah, and they go, "Yeah, but we'll be different." It's like, well, maybe, or maybe it's just a rubbish site for a motel. And I think there's probably, you know that in your sort of local high street, there is on one of my local high street, it's normally on a corner for some reason, it becomes a restaurant, a different restaurant every 12 months without fail. At some point, somebody's going to realise you can't run a successful restaurant from that corner for whatever reason, right? And it should become an estate agent like everything else, right? But we believe things will be different for us. Now, of course, every now and then someone does turn it into a brilliant destination motel or a fantastically successful restaurant. These things do happen. So we need that optimism just to sort of, or we do it. I think the reason lotteries survive is the optimism bias. If you're a rational person, you know the best way to win at the lottery is to never play it and keep the money. But if that was the case, all lotteries would implode in a puff of logic. But as we can see, they do not, right? Because people hope that they will buy the tickets. I've recently learned apparently the poorer people are when they play the lottery, the earlier in the lottery cycle they like to buy their ticket, like the moment after the last draw's been done, because then the hope lasts longer. It's a horrible thought, really, isn't it? I shouldn't have mentioned it. It's a very depressing thought. So one thing is we need to overcome risk. The other thing is we need to be able to discount the role that luck plays in outcomes. And I think this is, there's a brilliant book just come out called Success and Luck by Robert Frank, an economist, Robert Frank. So he gives the example that he says, it's not that successful people don't work hard and have talent. They almost unquestionably have worked hard and do have talent. There are very few people who are wildly successful purely through chance. Some people might remember there's a film with a character called Chancery in play. It was the last film that, I've forgotten, Peter Sellers was in. An old 70s film. No one knows old 70s films now. It's Being There, yeah. It's based on a Jerzy Kosinski novel. No, note to self, 70s film references. Right, so. But this character, he just lucks from one thing to another, and he becomes an advisor to the president. And he's basically a kind of almost mute gardener. He just says a few words, but they happen to be exactly the right words at the right time, and he sort of bounces up through the system. The example Frank gives is about track and field athletes. There are 4 track and field events where the authorities who keep the records measure wind assistance, because they're events which take place all in one direction, right? So they are long jump, triple jump, 100 metres and 110 metres hurdles. So if the wind is too strong, there's too strong a tailwind, the record will be disallowed, right? That's the upshot. Of the 8 standing world records, 7 of them have been set with a tailwind, several of those with a tailwind within a hair's breadth of the maximum allowed. Now, Usain Bolt, as the men's 100 metres world record holder, is unquestionably a brilliant athlete, right? Unquestionably, he has great talent, he has great natural ability, he trains pretty hard, although I'm told not as hard as he might do. So Michael Johnson talking, he says, if the man only trained harder, he could beat my 400 metres record. My only consolation is he's too lazy, right? So, so he says, I have said that to him. I said, you're braver than I am, then, right? So, but what Usain Bolt probably doesn't tell him as he races, he trains another day hard for another races. One day, if I train hard enough, I'll be in the right stadium at the right time when the wind is blowing, right? Because that will be a depressing thought, right? So working hard will get you to the Olympics. Working hard will even get you a gold. Working hard with the wind blowing will get you a world record, right? If we think about that, we need to work hard just to be in the right place, the right time to fail. There was a French sprinter I noticed came last in the 2012 100 metres Olympics because he's the only white sprinter, so it made him the fastest white man in the world. And I can't remember his name, which is indicative really of the whole thing, right? But he was only like a split second slower than Bolt, right? So like a lifetime's effort to be forgotten and last and French, Right? That's his fate, right? And he's saying people are hard on, say, a tennis player like Tim Henman. You have to work incredibly hard to fail like Tim Henman. To be consistently third is extraordinarily hard. The problem is that we're pattern-seeking creatures. If we look at any sort of set of data, we see patterns even if they're not really there. And this means that we're very prone, when we choose our colleagues or who should be in our team or who our leaders should be, to see patterns of success and think that they must be caused by something. So it's true that there are certain firms, I'm led to believe, where they have a simple policy where they rank everyone's performance and they promote the top 20% and fire the bottom 20%. Right? Which, again, at least it has the merit of simplicity and clarity. But what it doesn't allow for is that the top 20% might be average but lucky that year, and the bottom 20% might have been people who took real risks and could be very useful to you later and just happened to be unlucky. Kahneman, again, gives an example of some early work he did with the Israeli Air Force, who had a process where they ranked their pilots, and if pilots were successful, they were rewarded, and if they were unsuccessful, they were punished. And they noticed that the next year, unsuccessful pilots got better, so they concluded punishment worked, while good pilots seemed to get a little bit worse, so they concluded that treating them softly made them soft and useless. Kahneman merely pointed out this is just regression to the mean. If someone has a good year, they're likely to have a slightly worse year the next year. If you've been very brilliant, your next thing is likely to be slightly less brilliant. If you've had a very bad year, you have to really put the effort in to stay that bad. Some people do manage it, of course, right? But, some people do manage to stay at the very top of their game, but most people, there's a bit of variation. And he's saying, if you look at this statistically and clearly, all you see is that people aren't consistent year to year. That's all that's going on here. Of course, the Air Force, being the Air Force, go, no, we should probably just punish more people. So he said, it was an early learning, he said, that you can be right, it doesn't mean people will listen to you. So we have these instincts, these very clear instincts about what should work and what should make great leadership, and what should make great teams. Now, I think what we actually see is that we get great teams when people can create the right circumstances to do things together. And that's not necessarily to do with the qualities of the people as individuals, so their determination or whatever. It's to do with the way things are brought together. Now, there's an exercise, an experiment I've become much beloved of, which is a problem-solving exercise, because surely the purpose of a team is to solve a problem better than one person alone could solve it, quicker or better. Right? That's what you want from a team. So there are two teams in this task. The first team, they're all put on an equal footing in that they're all given the same information about a problem. So I have an amusing picture to go with this, I believe. There we are. They're all given the same information about the problem, right? So, and in both cases, the teams solve the problem. So they all read the information about this problem they have to solve, and they discuss how to solve it, and they get to a solution in a certain period of time. And you ask them, did you sort of enjoy working with your colleagues and your teammates? And they report reasonably high scores. There's another team where the people are given quite different information. So they have contradictory information. So you have diverse opinion in the room. Those people don't really get on because they have things that tell them different things, and they have to start arguing it out. They also solve the problem, and they come out saying, yeah, I didn't enjoy that at all, right? That guy at the end, I don't like him. I'm going to say bad words about him later, right? So that woman at the end, she was stuck up, right? They fall out with each other. But who solves the problem quicker? The arguing group get to a problem much faster than the agreeing group, right? So it seems that if you want problems solved, you need a certain amount of discord, not violent discord, but you need different opinions in the room. This is the true value of diversity properly understood in a team or group situation is. The more different views you have, the more different information you bring to it, the less chance of missing something important, and therefore you're more likely to get to a better situation. Now this means that if you're running a team, you have to think, well, how can I bring together people with as many different opinions as possible, so that when they do necessarily lock horns, they can still come back to work the next day. Now, this is the thing that's come to intrigue me, is that now you all managed to be here for a talk that starts at 6:30. So either you're very senior and can walk out when you like, leaving everyone else to do the work, you have fantastically well-adjusted jobs, or you have no jobs at all, maybe. I know there's a possibility. But probably all of you have experienced or know people who work in incredibly long hours cultures. And I'm intrigued by this lack of balance between that what we really need from our colleagues, which is to be able to rub up against them a bit, and the fact that we work such long hours with people that they effectively become a surrogate family, which means that we can't afford to fall out with them. So the first thing I would hope to do in a team is to, one, send them home on time so that they can have more time disagreeing and then they can go away and get over it, and move them around a lot more. But if people are locked in a sort of dependent relationship with people, they have considerably high stakes in not disagreeing with each other. And that leads to false consensus and groupthink and a lack of exactly what it is that you wanted a team to do in the first place. So that's that challenge there. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about is we don't, in our personal narratives, particularly embrace failure. So there's a little Twitter storm at the moment. Someone published their CV of failures. Has anyone been involved in this? Because there's a Twitter storm, it means like 3 people have seen it in the real world, doesn't it? So there's this idea, this woman called Melanie, he does, to be fair, he's a Princeton academic called Julius Hofstadter. One of those names I'm never going to quite remember with confidence, I know it. Melanie Stefan is the woman who he got the idea from. And he's put, now I have to say, if you put together your CV of failure when you're a professor at Princeton, it's like, yeah, only so much failure up to a point, right? So it's the failure's on my way to obvious and transparent success, right? But what's interesting, this was picked up by Lucy Kellaway, the always amusing and insightful FT columnist, that's where I heard about it. And she observed, she sort of goes, it seems that the ratio of failure to success in our life should probably be about 4 to 1. And she observes of her own career, the one period where she went, so she made a list of all the, basically you list all the jobs you applied for that you didn't get, and all the sort of academic, if you went for academic things, and the prizes you entered and didn't win. You look at it, it says, there's one period in the middle where she says, well, I don't really fail at all. But interestingly, it's the sluggish period of my career. It's when I was first had children, I was bringing them up, but I was just trying to basically keep it together, and I just kept a steady, even keel. So she concludes 4 to 1 is the right ratio. If you're not out there failing that much, you're not trying hard enough. If you're failing more than that, you're probably a little foolhardy or blindly optimistic about what you can achieve. You're kind of Eddie the Eagle Edwards of corporate success, right? There's probably a point where it is going to break your neck and you should stop. And I think the point of the people who've been putting together these CVs of failure is, if we made failure more transparent, we would see more clearly what it contributed to success. Whereas if we have this airbrush world where we never talk about failure, or we never talk about things that went wrong and learn from them, then we form this unhelpful idea of our colleagues and our leaders. They're people who never make mistakes at all. Whereas in fact, this is the paradox, the behavioural economist Richard Thaler talks about this paradox. If you're a CEO and you have a company with a dozen divisions in it, you need your heads of those divisions. You need 2 or 3 of them to fail that year if you're going to be taking enough risk for the company to grow fast enough. But each of those heads of division doesn't want to fail. So how can you create a culture, how can you lead in a culture where people know that if they fail, they'll be cherished for their failure as much as their success? Now, I'm not saying that that's easy to do, and I suppose if I knew in a line how to do it, maybe I could become a massively over-rewarded CEO, right? And transparently, I haven't done that yet, and I have to say I think the years are closing in and it's not going to happen. But what can we do so that we know that people who are failing are also succeeding for us in a different way? So, I have some summary points here to leave you with. So what to do? First one is, you can never give enough credit. If we think back to the credit pie, always tell people they did a brilliant job and that most of it was down to them, right? That's what they believe, it's what they want to hear. It's not that credit isn't necessarily empty flattery, and it doesn't necessarily lead to complacency. You can still say, that went well, what can we do better? But you can never give enough credit. I think that's a clear learning. Another one is, I'm going to get into examples here, is soft credit is endless, whereas hard credit is limited. So if you reward people with praise and just telling them they've done a great job, you can say that to everyone. There's enough of that to go around, you can keep printing that money and it never deflates. If you reward them with real money, you've got a limited pot and you have to make a choice between who gets it and who doesn't, and then they all hate each other. So soft incentives are in fact a much better way of building team credit than hard ones. So there are other studies to prove that, but I have not time to go into them now. You can ask the questions. The real mark of leadership is to create circumstances for success, not to be the cause of success. And I think this leads to, if I go back to the invisible hand idea, my idea of a perfectly successful leader, and I was thinking about people I worked with who I admired, were the ones where, in fact, the extent to which I give them great credit as a leader is the extent to which they never took credit for anything. So the more they gave credit to everyone else and supported everyone else and did it and became more and more like the invisible hand, essentially becoming invisible and withdrawn, the better they seemed to be as leaders in my experience. Now, of course, the idea of becoming this kind of withering away of the leader, as you say, is maybe paradoxical. And it's certainly paradoxical, that great idea of the egotistical leader, the great sort of heroic champion. But this idea that we might rebalance our idea of, it's not how much credit you can take for yourself, but how much credit you can give away, which is your real mark of leadership. Is a useful test. We can all might say, how much have I let other people know what they did to help me become what I am today? And my final thought on this is I think these problems will always be with us. Because although as a human species, we are hardwired to be gregarious and to be clubbable and try and get on and form teams, the kind of work we do now is not like hunting and gathering, right? It's not simple, small group tribal behaviour. And it's a bit like the difference between speaking and writing. So the suggestion would be amongst evolutionary psychologists is that speaking is indeed hardwired. We have been speaking as a species long enough that we have bits of the brain that are devoted to speaking. Whereas reading and writing are recent enough inventions that when we read or write, we're improvising using parts of the brain basically designed to do other things. So that's why I've chosen this picture. This is what reading and writing sort of looks like in mental terms. It's a brilliant improvisation of stuff around to achieve this task. When we do something simple like sound someone out, get on with them, we're hardwired to do that. When we work in a complex international team or a lot of conference calls, via email, stuff like that, we're basically making it up as we're going along. We're improvising it and using a whole series of instincts designed for other things to try and make it work. So as it's an improvisation, I'd say we shouldn't be entirely unsurprised if sometimes there's some spectacular failures. But at the same time, as long as we allow it in that spirit, we should also expect there sometimes should be some spectacular successes. So I hope to leave you with that note of optimism. Thank you for listening.